Henry Saylor, who was killed in Covington in a quarrel with Antonio Finch, was a reporter on the Cincinnati Commercial. In the year 1859, a vacant dwelling on Vine Street in Cincinnati became the center of local excitement because of the strange sights and sounds said to be observed there nightly. According to the testimony of many reputable residents of the vicinity, these were inconsistent with any other hypothesis than that the house was haunted. Figures with something singularly unfamiliar about them were seen by crowds on the sidewalk as they passed in and out. No one could say just where they appeared upon the open lawn on their way to the front door by which they entered, nor at exactly what point they vanished as they came out. Or rather, while each spectator was positive enough about these matters, no two agreed. They were all similarly at variance in their descriptions of the figures themselves. Some of the bolder of the curious throng ventured on several evenings to stand upon the doorsteps to intercept them, or failing in this, get a closer look at them. These courageous men, it was said, were unable to force the door by their united strength, and were always hurled from the steps by some invisible agency and severely injured. The door immediately afterward opened, apparently of its own volition, to admit or free some ghostly guest. The dwelling was known as the Roscoe House. A family of that name had lived there for some years, and then, one by one, disappeared, the last to leave being an old woman. Stories of foul play and successive murders had always been rife, but never authenticated. One day, during the prevalence of excitement, Saylor presented himself at the office of the Commercial for orders. He received a note from the city editor, which read as follows: "Go and pass the night alone in the haunted house on Vine Street, and if anything occurs, make 2 columns." Saylor obeyed his superior. He could not afford to lose his position on the paper. Apprising the police of his intention, he made an entrance through a rear window before dark, walked through the deserted rooms, bare of furniture, dusty and desolate, and seated himself at last in the parlor, on an old sofa that he had dragged in from another room, watching the deepening of the gloom as night came on. Before it was altogether dark, the curious crowd had collected in the street, silent as a rule, and expectant, with here and there a scoffer uttering his incredulity and courage with scornful remarks or ribald cries. None knew of the anxious watcher inside. He feared to make a light. The uncurtained windows would have betrayed his presence, subjecting him to insult, possibly injury. Moreover, he was too conscientious to do anything to enfeeble his impressions, and unwilling to alter any of the customary conditions under which the manifestations were said to occur. It was now dark outside, but light from the street faintly illuminated the part of the room that he was in. He had opened every door in the whole interior, above and below, but all the outer ones were locked and bolted. Sudden exclamations from the crowd caused him to spring to the window and look out. He saw the figure of a man moving rapidly across the lawn toward the building, saw it ascend the steps, then a projection of the wall concealed it. There was a noise as of the opening and closing of the hall door. He heard quick, heavy footsteps along the passage, heard them ascend the stairs, heard them on the uncarpeted floor of the chamber immediately overhead. Saylor promptly drew his pistol, and groping his way up the stairs, he entered the chamber, dimly lit from the street. No one was there. He heard footsteps in an adjoining room and entered that. It was dark and silent. He struck his foot against some object on the floor, kneeled by it, and passed his hand over it. It was a human head, that of a woman. Lifting it by the hair, this iron-nerved man returned to the half-lighted room below, carried it near the window, and attentively examined it. While so engaged, he was half conscious of the rapid opening and closing of the outer door, and of footfalls sounding all around him. He raised his eyes from the ghastly object of his attention and saw himself as the center of a crowd of men and women dimly seen. The room was thronged with them. He thought the people had broken in. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said coolly, "you see me under suspicious circumstances, but—" His voice was drowned in peals of laughter, such laughter as is heard in asylums for the insane. The people around him pointed at the object in his hand, and their merriment increased as he dropped it, and it went rolling among their feet. They danced about it with grotesque gestures and attitudes that were obscene and indescribable. They struck it with their feet, urging it about the room from wall to wall, pushed and overthrew one another in their struggles to kick it, cursed, screamed, and sang snatches of ribald songs as the battered head bounded about the room as if in terror and trying to escape. At last it shot out of the door into the hall, followed by all with tumultuous haste. At that moment, the door closed with a sharp concussion. Sailor was alone, in dead silence. Carefully putting away his pistol, which he had held in his hand all the time, he went to a window and looked out. The street was deserted and silent. The lamps were extinguished, and the roofs and chimneys of the houses were sharply outlined against the dawn light in the east. He left the house, the door yielding easily to his hand, and walked to the commercial office. The city editor was still in his office asleep. Sailor woke him and said, "I have been at the haunted house." The editor stared blankly, as if not wholly awake. "Good God!" he cried. "Yes. Why not?" The editor made no answer but continued staring. "I passed the night there, it seems," said Sailor. "They say that things were uncommonly quiet out there," the editor said, trifling with a paperweight upon which he had dropped his eyes. "Did anything occur?" "Nothing whatever." About 3 miles from the little town of Norton, in Missouri, on the road leading to Maysville, stands an old house that was last occupied by a family named Harding. Since 1886, no one has lived in it, nor is anyone likely to live in it again. Time and the disfavor of those dwelling thereabout are converting it into a rather picturesque ruin. An observer unacquainted with its history would hardly put it into the category of haunted houses. Yet in all the regions around it, such is its evil reputation. Its windows are without glass, its doorways without doors. There are wide breaches in the shingle roof, and for lack of paint, the weatherboarding is a dun gray. But these unfailing signs of the supernatural are partly concealed and greatly softened by the abundant foliage of a large vine overrunning the entire structure. This vine, of a species that no botanist has ever been able to name, has an important part in the story of the house. The Harding family consisted of Robert Harding, his wife Matilda, Miss Julia Went, who was her sister, and 2 young children. Robert Harding was a silent, cold-mannered man who made no friends in the neighborhood and apparently cared to make none. He was about 40 years old, frugal, and industrious, and made a living from the little farm, which is now overgrown with brush and brambles. He and his sister-in-law were rather tabooed by their neighbors, who seemed to think that they were seen too frequently together. Not entirely their fault, for at these times they evidently did not challenge observation. The moral code of rural Missouri is stern and exacting. Mrs. Harding was a gentle, sad-eyed woman, lacking a left foot. At some point in 1884, it became known that she had gone to visit her mother in Iowa. That was what her husband said in reply to inquiries, and his manner of saying it did not encourage further questioning. She never came back, and 2 years later, without selling his farm or anything that was his, appointing an agent to look after his interests, or removing his household goods, Harding, with the rest of the family, left the country. Nobody knew where he went. Nobody at that time cared. Naturally, whatever was movable about the place soon disappeared, and the deserted house became haunted in the manner of its kind. One summer evening, 4 or 5 years later, the Reverend J. Gruber of Norton and a Maysville attorney named Hyatt met on horseback in front of the Harding place. Having business matters to discuss, they hitched their animals and went to the house. They sat on the porch to talk. Some humorous reference to the somber reputation of the place was made and forgotten as soon as it was uttered, and they talked of their business affairs until it grew almost dark. The evening was oppressively warm, and the air was stagnant. Instantly, both men started from their seats in surprise. A long vine that covered half the front of the house and dangled its branches from the edge of the porch above them was visibly and audibly agitated, shaking violently in every stem and leaf. "We shall have a storm," Hyatt exclaimed. Gruber said nothing but silently directed the others' attention to the foliage of adjacent trees, which showed no movement. Even the delicate tips of the boughs silhouetted against the clear sky were motionless. They hastily passed down the steps to what had been a lawn and looked upward at the vine, whose entire length was now visible. It continued in violent agitation, yet they could discern no disturbing cause. "Let us leave," said the minister. And leave they did. Forgetting that they had been traveling in opposite directions, they rode away together. They went to Norton, where they related their strange experience to several discreet friends. The next evening, at about the same hour, accompanied by two others whose names are not recalled, they were again on the porch of the Harding house, and again the mysterious phenomenon occurred. The vine was violently agitated, while under the closest scrutiny from root to tip, nor did their combined strength applied to the trunk serve to still it. After an hour's observation they retreated no less wise, it is thought, than when they had come. No great deal of time was required for these singular facts to rouse the curiosity of the entire neighborhood. By day and by night, crowds of people assembled at the Harding house seeking a sign. It does not appear that any found it, yet so credible were the witnesses mentioned, that none doubted the reality of the manifestations to which they testified. By either a happy inspiration or some destructive design, it was one day proposed. Nobody appeared to know from whom the suggestion came, to dig up the vine, and after a good deal of debate, this was done. Nothing was found but the root, yet nothing could have been more strange. For 5 or 6 feet from the trunk, which had at the surface of the ground a diameter of several inches, it ran downward single and straight, into a loose, friable earth. Then it divided and subdivided into rootlets, fibers, and filaments, most curiously interwoven. When carefully freed from soil, they showed a singular formation. In their ramifications and doublings back upon themselves, they made a compact network, having in size and shape an amazing resemblance to the human figure. Head, trunk, and limbs were there. Even the fingers and toes were distinctly defined, and many professed to see in the distribution and arrangement of the fibers in the globular mass representing the head a grotesque suggestion of a face. The figure was horizontal. The smaller roots had begun to unite at the breast. In terms of resemblance to the human form, this image was imperfect. At about 10 inches from one of the knees, the cilia forming that leg had abruptly doubled backward and inward upon their course of growth. The figure lacked the left foot. There was but one inference, the obvious one, but in the ensuing excitement, as many courses of action were proposed as there were incapable counselors, the matter was settled by the sheriff of the county, who, as the lawful custodian of the abandoned estate, ordered the root replaced and the excavation filled with the earth that had been removed. Later inquiry brought out only one fact of relevancy and significance. Mrs. Harding had never visited her relatives in Iowa, nor did they know that she was supposed to have done so. For Robert Harding and the rest of his family, nothing is known. The house retains its evil reputation, but the replanted vine is as orderly and well-behaved a vegetable as a nervous person could wish to sit under on a pleasant night when the katydids grate out their immemorial revelation, and the distant whippoorwill signifies his notion of what ought to be done about it. Philip Eckert lived for many years in an old weather-stained wooden house about 3 miles from the little town of Marion in Vermont. There must be quite a number of people living who remember him, not unkindly, I trust, and know something of the story that I am about to tell. Old man Eckert, as he was always called, was not of a sociable disposition and lived alone. As he was never known to speak of his own affairs, nobody thereabout knew anything of his past, nor of his relatives, if he had any. Without being particularly ungracious or repellent in manner or speech, he managed somehow to be immune to impertinent curiosity, yet exempt from the evil repute with which it commonly revenges itself when baffled. So far as I know, Mr. Eckert's renown as a reformed assassin or a retired pirate of the Spanish Main had not reached any ear in Marion. He made his living cultivating a small, not very fertile farm. One day he disappeared, and a prolonged search by his neighbors failed to turn him up or throw any light on his whereabouts or whyabouts. Nothing indicated preparation to leave. All was as he might have left it to go to the spring for a bucket of water. For a few weeks, little else was talked of in that region. Then Old Man Eckert became a village tale for the ear of the stranger. I do not know what was done regarding his property. The correct legal thing, doubtless. The house was standing, still vacant and conspicuously unfit, when I last heard of it some 20 years. Of course, it came to be considered haunted, and the customary tales were told of moving lights, dolorous sounds, and startling apparitions. At one time, about 5 years after the disappearance, these stories of the supernatural became so rife, or through some attesting circumstances, seemed so important, that some of Marion's most serious citizens deemed it well to investigate. And to that end, they arranged for a night session on the premises. The parties to this undertaking were John Holcomb, an apothecary, Wilson Merle, a lawyer, and Andres C. Palmer, the teacher of the public school, all men of consequence and repute. They were to meet at Holcomb's house at 8 o'clock in the evening of the appointed day, and go together to the scene of their vigil, where certain arrangements for their comfort, a provision of fuel, and the like, for the season was winter, had already been made. Palmer did not keep the engagement, and after waiting a half hour for him, the others went to the Eckert house without him. They established themselves in the principal room before a glowing fire, and without other light than it gave, awaited events. It had been agreed to speak as little as possible. They did not even renew the exchange of views regarding the defection of Palmer, which had occupied their minds along the way. Probably an hour had passed without incident, when they heard not without emotion, doubtless the sound of an opening door in the rear of the house, followed by footfalls in the room adjoining that in which they sat. The watchers rose to their feet but stood firm, prepared for whatever might ensue. A long silence followed. How long neither would afterward undertake to say. Then the door between the two rooms opened, and a man entered. It was Palmer. He was pale, as if from excitement, as pale as the others felt themselves. His manner, too, was singularly distraught. He neither responded to their salutations, nor so much as looked at them, but walked slowly across the room in the light of the failing fire, opening the front door and passing out into the darkness. It seems to have been the first thought of both men that Palmer was suffering from fright, that something seen, heard, or imagined in the back room had deprived him of his senses. Acting on the same friendly impulse, both ran after him through the open door. But neither they nor anyone ever again saw or heard of Andres Palmer. This much was ascertained the next morning, during the session of Messrs. Holcomb and Merle at the haunted house. A new snow had fallen to a depth of several inches upon the old. In this snow, Palmer's trail from his lodging in the village to the back door of the Eckert house was conspicuous. But there it ended. From the front door, nothing led away but the tracks of the two men who swore that he preceded them. Palmer's disappearance was as complete as that of Old Man Eckert himself, whom, indeed, the editor of the local paper somewhat graphically accused of having reached out and pulled him in. On the road leading north from Manchester, in eastern Kentucky, to Boonville, 20 miles away, stood, in 1862, a wooden plantation house of somewhat better quality than most of the dwellings in that region. The house was destroyed by fire in the year following, probably by some stragglers from the retreating column of General George W. Morgan, when he was driven from Cumberland Gap to the Ohio River by General Kirby Smith. At the time of its destruction, it had been vacant for 4 or 5 years. The fields around it were overgrown with brambles, the fences gone, and even the few Negro quarters and outhouses generally had fallen partly into ruin by neglect and pillage. The Negroes and poor whites of the vicinity found in the building and fences an abundant supply of fuel, of which they availed themselves without hesitation, openly, and by daylight. By daylight alone, after nightfall, no human being, except passing strangers, ever went near the place. It was known as the Spook House, that it was tenanted by evil spirits, visible, audible, and active. No one in all that region doubted any more than he doubted what he was told of Sundays by the traveling preacher. Its owner's opinion of the matter was unknown. He and his family had disappeared one night, and no trace of them had ever been found. They left everything: household goods, clothing, provisions, the horses in the stable, the cows in the field, the Negroes in the quarters. All as it stood. Nothing was missing, except a man, a woman, 3 girls, a boy, and a baby. It was not altogether surprising that a plantation where 7 human beings could be simultaneously effaced and nobody the wiser should be under some suspicion. One night in June 1859, 2 citizens of Frankfurt, Colonel J.C. McCardle, a lawyer, and Judge Myron Vey, of the state militia, were driving from Boonville to Manchester. Their business was so important that they decided to push on, despite the darkness and the mutterings of an approaching storm, which eventually broke upon them just as they arrived opposite the Spook House. The lightning was so incessant that they easily found their way through the gateway and into a shed, where they hitched and unharnessed their team. They then went to the house, through the rain, and knocked at all the doors without getting any response. Attributing this to the continuous uproar of the thunder, they pushed at one of the doors, which yielded. They entered without further ceremony and closed the door. That instant, they were in darkness and silence. Not a gleam of the lightning's unceasing blaze penetrated the windows or crevices. Not a whisper of the awful tumult reached them there. It was as if they had suddenly been stricken blind and deaf. And McCardle afterward said that for a moment he believed himself to have been killed by a stroke of lightning as he crossed the threshold. The rest of this adventure can as well be related, in his own words, from the Frankfurt Advocate of August 6, 1876. When I had somewhat recovered from the dazing effect of the transition from uproar to silence, my first impulse was to reopen the door, which I had closed, and from the knob of which I was not conscious of having removed my hand. I felt it distinct still in the clasp of my fingers. My notion was to ascertain, by stepping again into the storm, whether I had been deprived of sight and hearing. I turned the doorknob and pulled open the door. It led into another room. This apartment was suffused with a faint greenish light, the source of which I could not determine, making everything distinctly visible, though nothing was sharply defined. Everything, I say, but in truth, the only objects within the blank stone walls of that room were human corpses. In number, they were perhaps 8 or 10. It may well be understood that I did not truly count them. They were of different ages, or rather sizes, from infancy up, and of both sexes. All were prostrate on the floor, excepting one, apparently a young woman, who sat up, her back supported by an angle of the wall. A baby was clasped in the arms of another, older woman. A half-grown lad lay face downward across the legs of a full-bearded man. 1 or 2 were nearly naked, and the hand of a young girl held the fragment of a gown that she had torn open at the breast. The bodies were in various stages of decay, all greatly shrunken in face and figure. Some were little more than skeletons. While I stood stupefied with horror by this ghastly spectacle, and still holding open the door, by some unaccountable perversity, my attention was diverted from the shocking scene and concerned itself with trifles and details. Perhaps my mind, with an instinct of self-preservation, sought relief in matters that would relax its dangerous tension. Among other things, I observed that the door that I was holding open was made of heavy iron plates that were riveted. Equidistant from one another and from the top and bottom, 3 strong bolts protruded from the beveled edge. I turned the knob, and they were retracted flush with the edge. I released it, and they shot out. It was a spring lock. On the inside, there was neither a knob nor any kind of projection. A smooth surface of iron. While noting these things with an interest and attention that it now astonishes me to recall, I felt myself thrust aside, and Judge Vey, whom in the intensity and vicissitudes of my feelings I had altogether forgotten, pushed me into the room. "Do not go in there. Let's get out of this dreadful place." He gave no heed to my entreaties, but as fearless a gentleman as lived in all the South, walked quickly to the center of the room, kneeled beside one of the bodies for a closer examination, and tenderly raised its blackened and shriveled head in his hands. A strong, disagreeable odor came through the doorway, completely overpowering me. My senses reeled. I felt myself falling, and in clutching at the edge of the door for support, I pushed it shut with a sharp click. I remember no more. 6 weeks later, I recovered my reason in a hotel in Manchester, where I had been taken by strangers the next day. For all these weeks, I had suffered from a nervous fever, attended by constant delirium. I had been found lying on the road several miles away from the house, but how I had escaped from it to get there, I never knew. On recovery, or as soon as my physicians permitted me to talk, I inquired about the fate of Judge Vey, whom it quieted me as I now know. They represented as well and at home. No one believed a word of my story, and who can wonder? And who can imagine my grief when, upon arriving at my home in Frankfurt 2 months later, I learned that Judge Vey had never been heard of since that night. I then regretted bitterly the pride that, since the first few days after the recovery of my reason, had forbidden me to repeat my discredited story and insist on its truth. With all that afterward occurred, the examination of the house, the failure to find any room corresponding to that which I have described, the attempt to have me adjudged insane, and my triumph over my accusers, the readers of The Advocate are familiar. After all these years, I am still confident that excavations, which I have neither the legal right to undertake nor the wealth to, would reveal the secret of the disappearance of my unhappy friend, and possibly of the former occupants and owners of the deserted and now destroyed house. I do not despair of yet bringing about such a search, and it is a source of deep grief to me that it has been delayed by the undeserved hostility and unwise incredulity of the family and friends of the late Judge Vey. Colonel McCardle died in Frankfurt on the 13th day of December, in the year 1879. "In order to take that train," said Colonel Levering, sitting in the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, "you will have to remain nearly all night in Atlanta. That is a fine city, but I advise you not to put up at the Breathitt House, one of the principal hotels. It is an old wooden building in urgent need of repairs. There are breaches in the walls that you could throw a cat through. The bedrooms have no locks on the doors, no furniture but a single chair in each, and a bedstead without bedding, just a mattress. Even with these meager accommodations, you cannot be sure that you will have a monopoly. You must take your chance of being stowed in with a lot of others. Sir, it is a most abominable hotel." The night that I passed was an uncomfortable night. I got in late and was shown to my room on the ground floor by an apologetic night clerk with a tallow candle, which he considerately left with me. I was worn out by 2 days and a night of hard railway travel, and had not entirely recovered from a gunshot wound in the head received in an altercation. Rather than look for better quarters, I lay down on the mattress without removing my clothing and fell asleep. Along toward morning I awoke. The moon had risen and was shining in at the uncurtained window, illuminating the room with a soft bluish light that somehow seemed a bit spooky, though I dare say it had no uncommon quality. All moonlight is that way if you will observe it. Imagine my surprise and indignation when I saw the floor occupied by at least a dozen other lodgers. I sat up, earnestly damning the management of that unthinkable hotel, and was about to spring from the bed to go and make trouble for the night clerk, him of the apologetic manner and the tallow candle, when something in the situation affected me with a strange indisposition to move. I suppose I was what a story writer might call frozen with terror. Those men were obviously all dead. They lay on their backs, disposed orderly along 3 sides of the room, their feet to the walls, Against the other wall, farthest from the door, stood my bed and the chair. All the faces were covered, but under their white cloths, the features of the two bodies that lay in the square patch of moonlight near the window showed a sharp profile as to the nose and chin. I thought this was a bad dream and tried to cry out, as one does in a nightmare, but could make no sound. At last, with a desperate effort, I threw my feet to the floor, and passing between the two rows of clouded faces and the two bodies that lay nearest the door, I escaped from the infernal place and ran to the office. The night clerk was there, behind the desk, sitting in the dim light of another tallow candle, just sitting and staring. He did not rise. My abrupt entrance produced no effect upon him, though I must have looked like a veritable corpse myself. It occurred to me then that I had not before really observed the fellow. He was a little chap, with a colorless face and the whitest, blankest eyes I ever saw. He had no more expression than the back of my hand. His clothing was— "Damn you," I said. "What do you mean?" Just the same, I was shaking like a leaf in the wind, and did not recognize my own voice. The night clerk rose, bowed apologetically, and, well, he was no longer there, and at that moment I felt a hand laid upon my shoulder from behind. Just fancy that if you can. Unspeakably frightened, I turned and saw a portly, kind-faced gentleman who asked, "What is the matter, my friend?" I was not long in telling him, but before I put an end to it, he went pale himself. "See here," he said, "are you telling the truth?" I had now got myself in hand, and terror had given place to indignation. "If you dare to doubt it," I said, "I'll hammer the life out of you." "No," he replied, "don't do that. Just sit down till I tell you. This is not a hotel. It used to be. Afterward, it was a hospital, waiting a tent. The room that you mentioned was the dead room. There were always plenty of dead. The fellow that you call the night clerk used to be that. But later he booked the patients as they were brought in. I don't understand his being here. He has been dead for a few weeks." "And who are you?" I blurted out. "Oh, I look after the premises. I happened to be passing just now and seeing a light in here. I came in to investigate. Let us have a look into that room," he added, lifting the sputtering candle from the desk. "I'll see you at the devil first," said I, bolting out of the door into the street. "Sir, that Breathitt House in Atlanta is a beastly place. Don't you stop there. God forbid. Your account of it certainly does not suggest comfort. By the way, Colonel, in September 1864, shortly after the siege, to the south of where the road between Leesville and Hardy, in the state of Missouri, crosses the East Fork of May Creek, stands an abandoned house. Nobody has lived in it since the summer of 1879, and it is fast going to pieces. For some 3 years before the date mentioned above, it was occupied by the family of Charles May, from one of whose ancestors the creek near which it stands took its name. Mr. May's family consisted of a wife, an adult son, and 2 young girls. The son's name was John. The names of the daughters are unknown to the writer of this sketch. John May was of a morose and surly disposition, not easily moved to anger, but having an uncommon gift of sullen, implacable hate, of a sunny, jovial disposition, but with a quick temper like a sudden flame kindled in a wisp of straw, which consumes it in a flash and is no more. He cherished no resentments, and his anger was gone. He was quick to make overtures for reconciliation. He had a brother living nearby who was unlike him in respect of all this, and it was a current witticism in the neighborhood that John had inherited his disposition from his uncle. One day a misunderstanding arose between father and son. Harsh words ensued, and the father struck the son full in the face with his fist. John quietly wiped away the blood that followed the blow, fixed his eyes on the already penitent offender, and said with cold composure, "You will die for that." The words were overheard by 2 brothers named Jackson, who were approaching the men at the moment, but seeing them engaged in a quarrel, they retired, apparently unobserved. Charles May afterward related the unfortunate occurrence to his wife and explained that he had apologized to the son for the hasty blow, but without avail. The young man not only rejected his overtures, but refused to withdraw his terrible threat. Nevertheless, there was no open rupture of relations. John continued living with the family, and things went on very much as before. One Sunday morning, in June 1879, about 2 weeks after what has been related, May Sr. left the house immediately after breakfast, taking a spade. He said he was going to make an excavation at a certain spring in a wood about a mile away so that the cattle could obtain water. John remained in the house for some hours, variously occupied with shaving himself, writing letters, and reading a newspaper. His manner was very nearly what it usually was. Perhaps he was a trifle more sullen and surly. At 2 o'clock, he left the house. At 5, he returned. For some reason not connected with any interest in his movements, which is not now recalled, the time of his departure and that of his return were noted by his mother and sisters, as was attested at his trial for murder. It was observed that his clothing was wet in spots, as if, as the prosecution afterward pointed out, he had been removing bloodstains from it. His manner was strange, and his look was wild. He complained of illness, and going to his room, he took. May Sr. did not return. Later that evening, the nearest neighbors were aroused, and during that night and the following day, a search was conducted through the wood where the spring was. It resulted in little but the discovery of both men's footprints in the clay around the spring. John May, in the meantime, had grown rapidly worse with what the local physician called brain fever, and in his delirium, he raved of murder, but did not say whom he conceived to have been murdered, or whom he imagined to have done the deed. But his threat was recalled by the brothers Jackson, and he was arrested on suspicion, and a deputy sheriff was put in charge of him at his home. Public opinion ran strongly against him, but for his illness, he would probably have been hanged by a mob. As it was, a meeting of the neighbors was held on Tuesday, and a committee was appointed to watch the case and take such action at any time as circumstances might seem to warrant. On Wednesday, everything changed. From the town of Nolan, 8 miles away, came a story that shed quite a different light on the matter. Nolan consisted of a schoolhouse, a blacksmith's shop, a store, and a half-dozen dwellings. The store was kept by Henry Odell, a cousin of the elder May. On the afternoon of May's disappearance, Mr. Odell and 4 of his neighbors, men of credibility, were sitting in the store smoking and talking. It was a warm day, and both the front and the back doors were open. At about 3 o'clock, Charles May, who was well known to 3 of them, entered at the front door and passed out at the rear. He was without a hat or coat. He did not look at them or return their greeting, a circumstance that did not surprise him, for he was evidently seriously hurt. Above the left eyebrow was a wound, a deep gash from which the blood flowed, covering the whole left side of the face and neck and saturating his light gray shirt. Oddly enough, the thought foremost in the minds of all was that he had been fighting and was going to the brook directly at the back of the store to wash himself. Perhaps there was a feeling of delicacy, a backwoods etiquette that restrained them from following him to offer assistance. The court records from which mainly this narrative is drawn are silent as to anything but the fact. They waited for him to return, but he did not return. Bordering the brook behind the store is a forest extending for 6 miles back to the Medicine Lodge Hills. As soon as it became known in the neighborhood of the missing man's dwelling that he had been seen in Nolan, there was a marked alteration in public sentiment and feeling. The Vigilance Committee went out of existence without the formality of a resolution. The search along the wooded bottomlands of May Creek was stopped, and nearly the entire male population of the region took to beating the bush about Nolan and in the Medicine Lodge Hills. But for the missing man, no trace was found. One of the strangest circumstances of this strange case is the formal indictment and trial of a man for murder of one whose body no human being professed to have seen. One not known to be dead. We are all more or less familiar with the vagaries and eccentricities of frontier law, but this instance, it is thought, is unique. However that may be, it is of record that on recovering from his illness, John May was indicted for the murder of his missing father. Counsel for the defense appears not to have demurred, and the case was tried on its merits. The prosecution was spiritless and perfunctory. The defense easily established, with regard to the deceased, an alibi. If during the time in which John May must have killed Charles May, if he killed him at all, Charles May was miles away from where John May must have been, it is plain that the deceased must have come to his death at the hands of someone else. John May was acquitted, immediately left the country, and has never been heard of since that day. Shortly afterward, his mother and sisters moved to St. Louis, the farm having passed into the possession of a man who owns the adjoining land and has a dwelling of his own. The May house has ever since been vacant and has the somber reputation of being haunted. One day after the May family had left the country, some boys, playing in the woods along May Creek, found concealed under a mass of dead leaves, but partly exposed by the rooting of hogs, a spade, nearly new and bright, except for a spot on one edge, which was rusted and stained with blood. The implement had the initial CM cut into the handle. This discovery renewed, to some degree, the public excitement of a few months before. The earth near the spot where the spade was found was carefully examined, and the result was the finding of the dead body of a man. It had been buried under 2 or 3 feet of soil, and the spot was covered with a layer of dead leaves and twigs. There was but little decomposition, a fact attributed to some preservative properties in the mineral-bearing soil. Above the left eyebrow was a wound, a deep gash from which blood had flowed, covering the whole left side of the face and neck and saturating the light gray shirt. The skull had been cut through by the blow. The body was that of Charles May. But what was it that passed through Mr. Odell's store at Nolan? Here is the queer story of David William Duck, related by himself. Duck is an old man living in Aurora, Illinois, where he is universally respected. He is commonly known, however, as Dead Duck. In the autumn of 1866, I was a private soldier of the 18th Infantry. My company was one of those stationed at Fort Phil Kearny, commanded by Colonel Carrington. The country is more or less familiar with the history of that garrison, particularly with the slaughter by the Sioux of a detachment of 81 men and officers, none escaping, through disobedience of orders by its commander, the brave but reckless Captain Fetterman. When that occurred, I was trying to make my way with important dispatches to Fort C. F. Smith on the Big Horn. As the country swarmed with hostile Indians, I traveled by night and concealed myself as best I could before daybreak. The better to do so, I went afoot, armed with a Henry rifle and carrying 3 days' rations in my haversack. For my second place of concealment, I chose what seemed in the darkness, a narrow cañon leading through a range of rocky hills. It contained many large boulders detached from the slopes of the hills. Behind one of these, I made my bed for the day and soon fell asleep. It seemed as if I had hardly closed my eyes, though in fact it was near midday, when I was awakened by the report of a rifle, the bullet striking the boulder just above my body. A band of Indians had trailed me and had me nearly surrounded. The shot had been fired with an execrable aim by a fellow who had caught sight of me from the hillside above. The smoke of his rifle betrayed him, and I was no sooner on my feet than he was off his and rolling down the declivity. Then I ran in a stooping posture, dodging among the clumps of sagebrush in a storm of bullets from invisible enemies. The rascals did not rise and pursue, which I thought rather queer, for they must have known by my trail that they had to deal with only one man. The reason for their inaction was soon made clear. I had not gone 100 yards before I reached the limit of my run, the head of the gulch, which I'd mistaken for a cannon. It terminated in a concave breast of rock, nearly vertical and destitute of vegetation. In that cul-de-sac, I was caught like a bear in a pen. Pursuit was needless. They waited. For 2 days and nights, crouching behind a rock topped with a growth of mesquite, and with the cliff at my back, suffering agonies of thirst and absolutely hopeless of deliverance. I fought the fellows at long range, firing occasionally at the smoke of their rifles, as they did at mine. Of course, I did not dare to close my eyes at night, and lack of sleep was a keen torture. I remember the morning of the third day, which I knew was to be my last. I remember rather indistinctly that in my desperation and delirium, I sprang out into the open and began firing my repeating rifle without seeing anybody to fire at. And I remember no more of that fight. The next thing that I recollect was my pulling myself out of a river just at nightfall. I had not a rag of clothing and knew nothing of my whereabouts, but all that night I traveled, cold and footsore, toward the north. At daybreak, I found myself at Fort C. F. Smith, my destination, but without my dispatches. The first man that I met was a sergeant named William Briscoe, whom I knew very well. You can imagine his astonishment at seeing me in that condition, and my own at his asking who the devil I was. "Dave Duck," I answered. "Who should I be?" He stared like an owl. "You do look it," he said, and I observed that he drew a little away from me. "What's up?" he added. I told him what had happened to me the day before. He heard me through, still staring, and then he said, "My dear fellow, if you are Dave Duck, I ought to inform you that I buried you 2 months ago. I was out with a small scouting party and found your body, full of bullet holes and newly scalped, somewhat mutilated otherwise too, I am sorry to say, right where you say you made your fight. Come to my tent, and I'll show you your clothing and some letters that I took from your person. The commandant has your dispatches." He performed that promise. He showed me the clothing, which I resolutely put on, and the letters, which I put into my pocket. He made no objection, then took me to the commandant, who heard my story and coldly ordered Briscoe to take me to the guardhouse. On the way, I said, "Bill Briscoe, did you really and truly bury the dead body that you found in these togs?" "Sure," he answered, "just as I told you. It was Dave Duck, all right. Most of us knew him. And now, you damned imposter, you better tell me who you are." "I'd give something to know," I said. A week later, I escaped from the guardhouse and got out of the country as fast as I could. Twice I have been back, seeking for that fateful spot in the hills, but unable to find it. In the year 1861, Bar Lassiter, a young man of 22, lived with his parents and an older sister near Carthage, Tennessee. The family was in somewhat humble circumstances, subsisting on the cultivation of a small and not very fertile plantation, owning no slaves. They were not rated among the best people of their neighborhood, but they were honest persons of good education, fairly well-mannered, and as respectable as any family could be if uncredentialed by personal dominion over the sons and daughters of. The elder Lassiter had that severity of manner that so frequently affirms an uncompromising devotion to duty and conceals a warm and affectionate disposition. He was of the iron of which martyrs are made, but in the heart of the matrix lurked a nobler metal, fusible at a milder heat, yet never coloring nor softening the hard exterior, by both heredity and environment. Something of the man's inflexible character touched the other members of the family. The Lassiter home, though not devoid of domestic affection, was a veritable citadel of duty. And duty, duty is as cruel as death. When the war came on, it was found in the family, as in so many others in that state, a divided sentiment. The young man was loyal to the Union, the others were savagely hostile. This unhappy division begot an insupportable domestic bitterness, and when the offending son and brother left home with the avowed purpose of joining the Federal Army, not a hand was laid in his, not a word of farewell was spoken, and not a good wish followed him out into the world, where he went to meet with such spirit as he might whatever fate awaited him. Making his way to Nashville, already occupied by the army of General Buell, he enlisted in the first organization that he found, a Kentucky regiment of cavalry, and in due time passed through all the stages of military evolution from raw recruit to experienced trooper. A right good trooper he was too, although in the oral narrative from which this tale is made, there was no mention of that. The fact was learned from his surviving comrades. Bar Lassiter has answered here to the sergeant whose name is Death. 2 years after he had joined it, his regiment passed through the region where he had come. The country thereabout had suffered severely from the ravages of war, having been occupied alternately and simultaneously by the belligerent forces, and a sanguinary struggle had occurred in the immediate vicinity of the Lassiter homestead. But of this, the young trooper was not aware. Finding himself in camp near his home, he felt a natural longing to see his parents and sister, hoping that in them, as in him, the unnatural animosities of the period had been softened by time and separation. Obtaining a leave of absence, he set foot in the late summer afternoon, and soon after the rising of the full moon, he was walking up the gravel path leading to the dwelling in which he had been born. Soldiers in war age rapidly, and in youth 2 years is a long time. Bar Lassiter felt himself an old man and had almost expected to find the place a ruin and a desolation. Nothing, apparently, was changed. At the sight of each dear and familiar object, he was profoundly affected. His heart beat audibly, and his emotion nearly suffocated him. An ache was in his throat. Unconsciously, he quickened his pace until he almost ran, his long shadow making grotesque efforts to keep its place beside him. The house was unlit, and the door was open. As he approached and paused to recover control of himself, his father came out and stood bareheaded in the moonlight. "Father," cried the young man, springing forward with an outstretched hand. The elder man looked him sternly in the face, stood a moment motionless, and without a word withdrew into the house, bitterly disappointed, humiliated, inexpressibly hurt, and altogether unnerved. The soldier dropped upon a rustic seat in deep dejection, supporting his head upon his trembling hand. But he would not have it so. He was too good a soldier to accept repulse as defeat. He rose and entered the house, passing directly to the sitting room. It was dimly lit by an uncurtained east window. On a low stool by the hearthside, the only piece of furniture in the place, sat his mother, staring into a fireplace strewn with blackened embers and cold ashes. He spoke to her tenderly, interrogatively, and with hesitation, but she neither answered, nor moved, nor seemed in any way surprised. True, there had been time for her husband to apprise her of their guilty son's return. He moved nearer and was about to lay his hand upon her arm when his sister entered from an adjoining room, looked him full in the face, passed him without a sign of recognition, and left the room by a door that was partly behind him. He had turned his head to watch her, but when she was gone, his eyes again sought his mother. She, too, had left the place. Bar Lassiter strode to the door by which he had entered. The moonlight on the lawn was tremulous, as if the sward were a rippling sea. The trees and their black shadows shook as if in a breeze. Blended with its borders, the gravel walk seemed unsteady and insecure to step on. This young soldier knew the optical illusions produced by tears. He felt them on his cheek and saw them sparkle on the breast of his trooper's jacket. He left the house and made his way back to camp. The next day, with no very definite intention and no dominant feeling that he could rightly have named, he again sought the spot. Within a half-mile of it, he met Bushrod Albro, a former playfellow and schoolmate, who greeted him warmly. "I am going to visit my home," said the soldier. The other looked at him rather sharply but said nothing. "I know," continued Lassiter, "that my folks have not changed, but—" "There have been changes," Albro interrupted. "Everything changes. I'll go with you if you don't mind. We can talk as we go." But Albro did not talk. Instead of a house, they found only fire-blackened foundations of stone, enclosing an area of compact ashes pitted by rain. Lassiter's astonishment was extreme. "I could not find the right way to tell you," said Albro. "In the fight a year ago, your house was burned by a federal shell. And my family, where are they? In heaven, I hope. All were killed by the shell." a nice hard turnpike, 9 or 10 kilometers long, connected Readyville with Woodbury. Readyville served as a Federal Army outpost in Murfreesboro, whereas Woodbury served as a Confederate Army outpost in Tullahoma. For months after the massive battle at Stone River, these outposts were constantly at odds, with most of the fighting taking place on the stated road between cavalry detachments. As a gesture of goodwill, the infantry and artillery occasionally participated in the game. One night, a squadron of Federal horses led by Major Seidel, a courageous and skilled officer, set out from Readyville on an unusually dangerous mission that demanded stealth, prudence, and silence. After passing the infantry pickets, the unit came across 2 cavalry vehicles looking into the darkness ahead. There should have been 3 of them. "Where is your other man?" the major inquired. "I ordered Dunning to be here tonight." "He rode forward, sir," said the man. "There was a little firing afterward, but it was a long one. It was against orders and against sense for Dunning to do that," the officer, clearly irritated, stated. "Why did he ride forward?" "I'm not sure, sir. He seemed a little restless. I guess he was scared." The invading force resumed its march once this exceptional reasoner and his companion were absorbed. Conversation was prohibited, and guns and accoutrements were not permitted to ring. All that could be heard were the horses tramping, and the movement was slow in order to have as little of that as possible. It was after midnight and fairly gloomy, though there was a sliver of moon hidden behind the clouds. The column's leader neared a dense forest of cedars bordering the road on both sides after about 2 or 3 miles. The major demanded a halt by simply halting, and, clearly scared, rode on alone to reconnoiter. He was followed, however, by his adjutant and 3 troopers, who remained a short way behind him and witnessed everything that happened. After roughly 100 yards of riding toward the woodland, the major abruptly reined in his horse and sat immobile in the saddle. A man, dimly visible and unmoving, stood near the side of the road, in a little open space about 10 paces away. The major's first thought was that he was relieved to have left his cavalcade behind. If this were an enemy and he escaped, he would have little to report. The expedition had not yet been discovered. A dark object was visible at the man's feet, but the officer couldn't figure it out. He drew his saber with the cavalryman's instinct and a special aversion to the firing of firearms. In response to the challenge, the individual on foot made no movement. It was a stressful and dramatic scene. The moon burst through a breach in the clouds, and the horseman, who was under the shadow of a grove of giant oaks, saw the footman plainly in a patch of white light. Trooper Dunning was unarmed and bareheaded. The item at his feet transformed into a dead horse, with a dead man lying at a right angle across the animal's neck, face up in the moonlight. "Dunning has had the fight of his life," was the major thought as he prepared to ride forward. Dunning motioned him back with his hand, then lowered his arm and pointed to the point where the road disappeared into the darkness of the cedar forest. The major understood, and returning to the head of his command, he turned his horse and rode back to the little group that had followed him and was already retiring to the rear in fear of his anger. "Dunning is just ahead of you there," he told the captain of his leading company. "He has killed his man and will have something to report." They waited carefully, sabers readied. But Dunning did not appear. The day broke in an hour, and the entire army advanced carefully ahead, its commander not entirely happy with his faith in Private Dunning. The expedition had failed, yet there was still work to be done. They discovered the fallen horse in a small clearing off the road. Trooper Dunning's body lay motionless as a statue, hours dead, at a straight angle across the animal's neck, face upward, like a bullet in the brain. An examination revealed substantial evidence that the cedar woodland had been seized by a large force of Confederate forces within a half hour. An ambush. General Buell's large army was in camp in the spring of 1862, getting ready for the campaign that resulted in the victory at Shiloh. It was a raw, untrained force, but some of its components had experienced hard enough service in the mountains of Western Virginia and Kentucky, with a fair amount of combat. The war was new, and soldiering was a new industry for the young American of the time, who found some aspects of it not quite to his liking. Subordination was the most important aspect of discipline. Unquestioning acquiescence to authority is not easy to master for someone who has been infused from childhood with the wonderful fallacy that all men are born equal, and the American volunteer in his green and salad days is among the worst known. That is how Private Bennett Story Green, one of Bull's soldiers, committed the indiscretion of assaulting his officer. He would not have done that later in the war. Like Sir Andrew Aguichi, he would have seen him damned first, but he didn't have time to improve his military demeanor. He was arrested on the officer's complaint, tried by court-martial, and condemned to death by shooting. "You could have thrashed me and let it go at that," the condemned man told the complaining witness, "because that's what you used to do at school, when you were Plainwell Dudley and I was as good as you. Nobody saw me hit you. Your discipline would not have suffered greatly." "I guess you're right, Ben Green," the lieutenant said. "Are you willing to forgive me? That is why I came to see you." There was no response, and an officer poking his head inside the guard tent, where the talk had taken place, informed me that the time allotted for the interview had run out. The next morning, when Private Green was shot to death by a squad of his colleagues in front of the entire brigade, Lieutenant Dudley turned his back on the terrible performance and whispered a plea for compassion, in which he himself was included. A few weeks later, while Buell's leading division was being carried across the Tennessee River to aid Grant's battered army, darkness fell, black and stormy. The division marched inch by inch through the wreckage of combat toward the adversary, who had withdrew slightly to rebuild his lines. The lightning, on the other hand, was completely black. It never stopped, and when the thunder didn't crack and roar, the men could hear the moans of the wounded, among whom they felt their way with their feet and stumbled in the gloom. The dead were present as well. There were enough of them. When the swarming advance had paused to resume anything resembling a line of battle, and skirmishers had been put forward in the first dim gray of the morning, word was passed along to call the roll. Lieutenant Dudley's company's first sergeant came to the front and began to name the soldiers alphabetically. He didn't have a written record, but he had an excellent memory. As he ran down the alphabet to G, the men responded to their names. Gorham. Here. Grey Rock. Here. The sergeant's memory was hampered by habit. Green. Here. The response was unequivocal, distinct, and unequivocal. The stunning nature of the incident was attested by a rapid movement and an agitation of the entire company front, similar to an electric shock. The sergeant paled and came to a halt. The captain approached him immediately and stated sharply, "Call that name again." Apparently, the Society for Psychical Research is not the first to be interested in the unknown. Bennett Green. Here. All eyes went to the familiar voice, and the two men in the order of stature between whom Green had frequently been in line turned and directly confronted each other. Once more, the unyielding investigator demanded, and once more came, a little tremulously, the name of the deceased. Bennett Story Green. Here! A single rifle shot was heard away to the front, beyond the skirmish line, almost immediately followed by the savage hiss of an approaching bullet, which, passing through the line, struck audibly, punctuating the captain's exclamation, "What the devil does it mean?" Lieutenant Dudley pushed his way through the ranks from the back. "It means this," he continued, tearing open his coat and revealing a visible crimson stain on his breast. His knees buckled, causing him to fall awkwardly and die. A short time later, the regiment was ordered out of line to relieve the overcrowded front, and due to some miscalculation in the game of battle, it was never again under fire. Bennett Green, an expert in military executions, never again indicated his presence at one. In northern Alabama, a man stood on a railroad bridge peering down into the rapid river 20 feet below. The man had his hands behind his back, his wrists fastened with a cord. A rope was wrapped around his neck. It was attached to a strong crossed timber over his head, and the slack reached his knees. Some loose boards strewn on the railway sleepers provided a foothold for him and his executioners. Two private soldiers of the Federal Army, led by a sergeant who may have been a deputy sheriff in civilian life. A little distance away, on the same temporary platform, stood an officer dressed in his rank's clothing and armed. He was the captain of the ship. At each end of the bridge, a sentinel stood with his rifle in the support position, that is, vertical in front of the left shoulder, the hammer resting on the forearm flung straight across the chest. A formal and unnatural position that enforced an erect carriage of the body. It did not appear to be these two men's responsibility to know what was going on at the center of the bridge. They simply barricaded the two ends of the foot plank that crossed it. Nobody could be seen beyond one of the sentinels. The train ran straight into a woodland for 100 yards before bending and disappearing from view. Undoubtedly, there was another outpost further along. The other bank of the stream was open land, a moderate incline topped with a stockade of vertical tree trunks loopholed for rifles, with a single embrasure through which protruded the muzzle of a brass cannon commanding the bridge. The spectators were a single company of troops in line, at parade rest, the butts of the rifles on the ground, the barrels inclining slightly backward against the right shoulder, their hands crossed on the stock. A lieutenant stood to the right of the line, his sword pointed down on the ground, his left hand resting on his right. Except for the four men in the center of the bridge, no one moved. The company stood staring at the bridge, immobile. The sentinels facing the stream's banks could have been statues to beautify the bridge. The captain stood silently with his arms folded, monitoring his subordinates' work, but making no sign. Death is a dignitary who, when declared, is to be greeted with formal displays of reverence, even by those closest to him. Silence and fixity are expressions of courtesy in the code of military etiquette, an occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge pendulum with escapement. The man who was set to be hanged was apparently around 35 years old. He was a civilian, judging from his habit, which was that of a planter. His features were attractive. A straight nose, a firm jaw, a broad forehead, and long, dark hair combed straight back, falling behind his ears to the collar of his well-fitting frock coat. He had a mustache and a pointed beard, but no whiskers. His eyes were wide and dark gray, and he had a compassionate face that one would not anticipate from someone whose neck was wrapped in hemp. This was clearly not a common assassin. The liberal military law allows for the hanging of a wide range of people, even gentlemen. After finishing their preparations, the two private soldiers stepped back and each dragged away the plank on which they had been standing. The sergeant turned to face the captain, saluted, and moved in front of that officer, who moved back one. The condemned guy and the sergeant were now standing on opposite ends of the same plank, which spanned 3 of the bridge's cross ties. The civilian's position almost, but not quite, reached 4th. This board had been held in place by the captain's weight. Now it was supported by the sergeant's. When the former signaled, the latter would stand aside. The plank would tilt, and the doomed man would fall between 2 bonds. The arrangement commended itself as straightforward and effective, in his opinion. His face was not covered, nor were his eyes bandaged. He glanced at his unsteady footing for a minute before shifting his eyes to the whirling water of the stream flowing frantically beneath his boots. His attention was drawn to a piece of dancing driftwood, which he followed down the stream. What a sluggish stream! How slowly it appeared to travel! He closed his eyes to focus his final thoughts on his wife and children. The gold-tinged water, the brooding mists beneath the bank some distance down the stream, the fort, the troops, the piece of drift, all had diverted his attention, and suddenly he was aware of a fresh disturbance. Striking through his thoughts of his loved ones was a sound he couldn't ignore or explain. A sharp, unmistakable, metallic percussion similar to the stroke of a blacksmith's hammer on the anvil, with the same ringing tone. He wondered what it was, and whether it was infinitely distant or nearby. It appeared to be both. It returned on a regular basis, but at the rate of a death knell. He awaited each stroke with impatience, and for some reason, the silences became increasingly protracted, and the pauses were excruciating. The sounds became stronger and sharper as their frequency rose. They hurt his ear like a knife thrust, and he was afraid he'd shriek. The ticking of his watch was what he heard. He opened his eyes and saw the ocean under him once more. "If I could free my hands," said the man, "I might throw off the noose and spring into the stream. By diving, I could evade the bullets and swimming vigorously, reach the bank, take to the woods, and get home. My home, thank God, is as yet outside their lines. My wife and little ones are still beyond the invaders' farthest advance." The captain nodded to the sergeant as these thoughts, which had to be written down, flashed into the doomed man's brain rather than evolving from it. The sergeant took a step back. "Hold your," said Owl Creek Bridge. Farm hospitality. Peyton Farquhar was a prosperous planter from an old and well-known Alabama family. As a slave owner and politician, he was naturally an original separatist and fervent supporter of the Southern circumstances of an imperious nature, which it is unnecessary to relate here, had prevented him from joining the gallant army that had fought the disastrous campaigns culminating in the fall of Corinth, and he chafed under the ignoble restraint, yearning for the release of his energies, the larger life of the soldier, and the chance for distinction. That opportunity, he believed, would present itself as it does to all in times of war. Meanwhile, he did his best. No service was too humble for him to perform in aid of the South, and no adventure was too perilous for him to undertake if consistent with the character of a civilian who was at heart a soldier and who assented to at least a part of the frankly villainous dictum that all is fair in love and war in good faith and without too much qualification. A gray-clad soldier rode up to the gate and asked for a drink of water one evening while Farquhar and his wife were sitting on a rustic seat near the entrance to his estates. Mrs. Farquhar gladly served him with her own white hands. Her husband approached the dusty horseman as she was carrying water and inquired eagerly about news from the front. "The Yanks are repairing the railroads," the man continued, "and are getting ready for another advance. They have reached the Owl Creek Bridge, put it in order, and built a stockade on the north bank. The commandant has issued an order, which is posted everywhere, declaring that any civilian caught interfering with the railroad, its bridges, tunnels, or trains will be summarily hanged." "I saw the order." Farquhar inquired, "How far is it to the Owl Creek Bridge?" "About 30 miles. "Is there no force on this side of the creek?" "Only a picket post half a mile out, on the railroad, and a single sentinel at this end of the bridge. Suppose a man, a civilian and student of hanging, should elude the picket post and perhaps get the better of the sentinel," replied Farquhar with a grin. "What could he accomplish?" The soldier paused. "I was there about a month ago," he said. "I observed that the flood of last winter had lodged a great quantity of driftwood against the wooden pier at this end of the bridge. It is now dry and would burn like tow." The lady had now brought the soldier water, which he drank. He formally thanked her, bowed to her husband, and rode away. He returned to the property an hour later, after dark, heading north in the direction he had come from. He worked as a Federal scout. Peyton Farquhar lost consciousness and died as he plummeted straight downward through the bridge. He was jolted awake from this trance by the pain of a sudden pressure on his throat, followed by a sense of suffocation. Sharp, piercing agonies appeared to shoot from his neck down, through every fiber of his body and limbs. These pains appeared to flash along well-defined ramification lines and to beat at an inconceivably quick rate. They appeared to be pulsating streams of fire, heating him to an unbearable temperature. In terms of his head, he was aware of nothing but a sense of fullness, of congestion. There was no thought accompanying these sensations. The cerebral part of his personality was already gone. He could only feel, and feeling was agony. He was aware of his surroundings moving. He swung through unfathomable arcs of oscillation, like a giant pendulum, encircled in a dazzling cloud, of which he was now only the flaming heart, devoid of corporeal reality. Then, all of a sudden, the light around him surged upward with the sound of a big splash. A terrifying roar was in his ears, and everything was cold and dark. He regained his ability to think. He realized the rope had snapped and he had fallen into the creek. There was no more strangulation. The noose around his neck was already drowning him and preventing water from entering his lungs. To perish while dangling at the bottom of a river, the thought seemed absurd to him. He opened his eyes in the darkness and saw a glint of light above him, but how far away, how inaccessible. He was still descending as the light became fainter and fainter until it was nothing more than a shimmer. Then it began to enlarge and lighten, and he realized he was rising toward the surface, though he did so reluctantly because he was now extremely comfortable. To be hanged and drowned, he reasoned. That is not so bad, but I do not wish to be shot. No, I will not be shot. That is not fair. He wasn't aware of any exertion, but a stinging pain in his wrist told him he was trying to release his hands. He watched the conflict as an idler might watch a juggler perform, with no interest in the outcome. What fantastic work! What magnificent, superhuman power! That was a fantastic effort. Bravo! His arms parted and soared upward, his hands dimly visible on each side in the increasing light. He watched them with renewed fascination as one, then the other, pounced on the rope around his neck. They ripped it apart and pushed it aside, its undulations mimicking those of a water snake. Put it back! Put it back! He believed he yelled to his hands, since the unwinding of the noose was followed by the most agonizing agony he had ever felt. His neck hurt brutally. His head was on fire, and his heart, which had been fluttering weakly, gave a big leap, attempting to force itself out through his mouth. His entire body was tormented and wrenched with unbearable agony, but his disobedient hands ignored the command. They pounded the water with fast, downward strokes, forcing him to the surface. He felt his head emerge. His eyes were blinded by the sunlight. His chest swelled convulsively, and his lungs devoured a big gulp of air, which he promptly expelled in a cry. He had regained control of his physical senses. They were certainly unusually sharp and alert. Something in his organic system's terrible disruption had so exalted and purified them that they recorded things never previously perceived. He could feel the ripples on his face and hear their distinct tones as they struck. He glanced at the forest on the stream's bank, noticed the individual trees, the leaves, and the veining of each leaf, and saw the insects that were on them. Locusts, brilliant-bodied flies, and gray spiders stretching their webs from twig to twig. He noticed the kaleidoscopic colors in the dewdrops on a million grass blades, the humming of the knots that danced above the stream's eddies, the beating of the dragonfly's wings, the strokes of the water spider's legs like oars that had elevated their boat. All of this created audible music. He heard the rush of a fish's body separating the water as it moved along beneath his eyes. He'd risen to the surface, facing downstream. In an instant, the visible world seemed to spin slowly around him. The bridge, the fort, the soldiers on the bridge, the captain, the sergeant, the two privates, his executioners. They stood out against the azure sky in silhouette. They yelled and gestured, pointing at him. The captain drew his pistol but did not discharge it. The others were unarmed. Their movements were strange and horrifying, and their forms were enormous. Suddenly, he heard a quick report, and something smartly struck the water within a few inches of his head, spraying his face. He heard a second report and looked over to see one of the sentinels with his rifle at his shoulder. A light cloud of blue smoke coming from the barrel. The man in the water noticed the man on the bridge, looking into his own via the rifle sights. He noticed it had a gray eye, and remembered reading that gray eyes were the sharpest, and that all outstanding marksmen had them. Nonetheless, this one had fallen short. Farquhar had been trapped in a counterswirl, and was now peering into the woodland on the bank, opposite the fort. The sound of a clear, high voice in a repetitive song now burst out behind him, and pierced and repressed all other sounds, including the beating of the waves in his ears. Although he was not a soldier, He had been to enough camps to understand the awful import of that methodical, drawling, aspirated chant. The lieutenant on shore was participating in the morning's task. How coldly and pitilessly! With what a steady, placid intonation, foreshadowing an imposing serenity in the men. Those horrible sentences dropped at precisely regulated intervals. Attention, company. Company. S. Shoulder arms. Ready. Aim. Aim. Required dove as deeply as he could. The water screamed in his ears like Niagara's voice, but he could hear the muffled thunder of the volley, and, rising again toward the surface, met dazzling shards of metal, singularly flattened and oscillating slowly downward. Some of them touched his face and hands before falling away and continuing their descent. One got stuck between his collar and neck. It was unbearably heated, so he yanked it out. As he returned to the surface, gasping for air, he realized he had been underwater for a long time. He was perceptibly farther downstream, closer to safety. The soldiers were nearly finished reloading. The metal ramrods gleamed in the sunlight as they were taken from the barrels, spun in the air, and put into their sockets. The two sentinels fired again, this time ineffectively. The chased man saw everything over his shoulder and began swimming aggressively against the current. His intellect was as active as his arms and legs, and he thought like lightning. The officer, he reasoned, will not repeat that Martinet's error. A volley is just as easy to avoid as a single shot. He's most likely already issued the order to fire at will. I can't possibly avoid them all. A horrible splash within 2 yards of him was followed by a tremendous rushing sound, diminuendo, that seemed to travel back through the air to the fort and died in an explosion that shook the river to its depths. The cannon had taken a hand in the game, and as he shook his head free from the commotion of the smitten water, he heard the deflected shot humming through the air ahead, and in an instant it was cracking and smashing the branches in the forest beyond. They will not do that again, he reasoned. The next time, they will use a grape charge. I must keep my gaze fixed on the gun. The smoke will alert me. The report arrives too late, trailing the missile. That's a nice gun. Suddenly he felt himself whirling round and round, spinning like a top. The water, the banks, the forest, the now distant bridge, the fort, and men. All were commingled and blurred. Objects were represented by their colors only. Circular horizontal streaks of color. That was all he saw. He had been caught in a vortex and was being whirled on with a velocity of advance and gyration that made him giddy and sick. In a few moments, he was flung upon the gravel at the foot of the left bank of the stream, the southern bank, and behind a projecting point that concealed him from his enemies. The sudden arrest of his motion and the abrasion of one of his hands on the gravel restored him, and he wept with delight. He dug his fingers into the sand, threw it over himself in handfuls, and audibly blessed it. It looked like diamonds, rubies, and emeralds. He could think of nothing beautiful that it did not resemble. The trees on the bank were giant garden plants. He noted a definite order in their arrangement and inhaled the fragrance of their blooms. A strange roseate light shone through the spaces among their trunks, and the wind made in their branches the music of Aeolian harps. He had no wish to perfect his escape. He was content to remain in that enchanting spot until a whiz and rattle of grape shot among the branches high over his head jolted him awake. The perplexed cannoneer had fired him a random farewell, and he jumped to his feet, dashed up the steep slope, and plunged into the forest. He had been traveling all day, establishing his course with the setting light. The forest appeared endless. Nowhere did he find a break in it, not even a woodman's road. He had not realized he lived in such a wild place. By nightfall, he was exhausted, footsore, and famished. The thoughts of his wife and children urged him on. At last, he found a road that led him in the right direction. It was as wide and straight as a city street, yet it seemed untraveled. No fields bordered it. There were no dwellings anywhere. Not even the barking of a dog suggested human habitation. The black bodies of the trees formed a straight wall on both sides. His neck was in pain, and when he lifted his hand to it, it was horribly swollen. He knew it had a circle of black where the rope had bruised it. His eyes felt congested. He couldn't close them. His tongue was swollen with thirst. He relieved its fever by thrusting it forward from between his teeth into the cold air. He must have fallen asleep while walking, because now he sees another scene. Perhaps he has simply recovered from a delirium. He stands at the gate of his own home. Everything as he left it, and everything is bright and beautiful in the morning sunshine. As he pushes open the gate and passes up the wide white walk, he sees a flutter of female garments. His wife, looking fresh, cool, and sweet, steps down from the veranda. Peyton Farquhar had died. His body, with a broken neck, swayed gently from side to side beneath the Owl Creek Bridge's timbers.